All right, for today's explainer, we are diving into a source that puts forward a seriously radical and honestly challenging history of Christianity. It suggests we should reframe it not as a belief system, but as a suppressed technology. So, let's get right into it.
So, the source material kicks things off by asking you a really profound question. What if the history we've all been taught is, well, incomplete? Or worse, intentionally edited? This really sets the stage for a journey into a past that, according to this text, was systematically wiped from the record.
And here's where we get to the core of the whole argument. The source claims that the original teaching was a practical liberation technology, a repeatable, teachable method for actually overcoming physical death. But over time, it got twisted into a control mechanism, a belief system designed to manage people by making salvation some far-off, otherworldly promise. So how does something like a technology for liberation become a tool for control? Well, according to the source, it all starts with one fundamental error, what it calls the single greatest heresy against that original teaching. And get this, the claim here is that the real original sin wasn't about disobeying some rule. It was simply accepting that death is a mandatory part of life. The source argues that the entire point of the original teaching was to prove that mortality isn't a requirement, but actually a problem that can be solved. This completely flips the script on the central figure, right? The Christos, according to this text, wasn't some one-time divine miracle that we can only worship from afar. No, it was a prototype, a proof of concept. You could almost think of it as a technical specification, showing what any human could potentially achieve, a state of consciousness that gives you mastery over your own biological processes. Okay, so if the original teaching was such a powerful technology, where did it go? How is it lost? Well, this next section of our source lays out exactly how it was systematically taken apart and basically turned into its polar opposite. The source maps out 5 key stages, and it's like a slow-motion dismantling of an incredible machine. First, it points to Paul, who it claims shifted the focus from practicing a method to just believing in a person. Then came the political compromise with the Roman Empire, the destruction of all the practical how-to texts, a philosophical move to cement death as necessary, and finally, a reformation that, challenged the church's power but kept the core death cult theology totally intact. Now, the Council of Nicaea, this was the big fork in the road. According to the source, a very deliberate choice was made. Defining Christ as a unique, unreachable God was perfect for the Roman Empire. It turns everyone into passive spectators. The other choice, seeing Christ as a perfected human who taught a method anyone could learn, well, that would have empowered individuals, and you can't really govern empowered individuals, can you? Okay, so this brings us to a really key player, someone our source claims was basically written out of the story to make this new power structure even possible. We've all heard the story, right? Peter is the rock on which the church is built. But the source material says, hold on a second, that's a later edit. It claims the actual undisputed leader of the original community in Jerusalem was James, Jesus' own brother. And the crazy part is, the source argues the proof is just hiding in plain sight, right inside the New Testament. In key passages, James is consistently named before Peter. At that crucial council of Jerusalem, it's James, not Peter, who stands up and makes the final ruling. And in Galatians, it seems like even Peter is kind of afraid of James's authority. And then the source drops this absolute bombshell from the Gospel of Thomas, one of those early texts that didn't make the final cut for the Bible. It's a direct, unambiguous appointment. Jesus tells his followers to go to James the Just, for whose sake heaven and earth came into being. I mean, that is a staggering claim. So you gotta wonder, right? If this powerful teaching and its real leader were suppressed, did they just vanish? Well, according to our source, not a chance. It just went underground and found a new home. This timeline is pretty amazing. It's like a secret history, tracing this incredible journey. The source argues that after Jerusalem was destroyed, James's followers fled. From there, their core teachings were preserved and even encoded within early Islam. They blossomed in Sufi mysticism and then eventually popped back up in the Hermetic traditions during the Renaissance. And when you lay them out side by side, the parallels are just, wow, they're striking. Both the original Jamesian tradition and Islam see Jesus as a human prophet, not God. They both deny the literal crucifixion, they reject the idea of original sin, and they both put a huge emphasis on works and daily ritual prayer. The source argues Islam didn't replace this early Christianity, it actually preserved its original structure.
All right, this brings us to the final and, maybe the most mind-bending part of this whole thing. How in the world does this hidden history connect to our world, right here, right now?
So the source basically says, what people used to call mysticism or magic, we can now start talking about it in the language of modern science. It points to things like quantum biology, which is exploring this wild idea that consciousness itself might operate at a subatomic level and could potentially influence physical reality.
And then there's epigenetics, the science that shows our genes aren't set in stone. It proves that our beliefs, our thoughts, and our environment can literally switch genes on and off. The source sees this as modern science validating that ancient principle, that consciousness can directly shape our biology.
And finally, it looks at research into bioelectricity, which shows these electrical fields in our bodies are like a blueprint for how our cells regenerate. And this leads to a massive question. What if miraculous healing was never supernatural at all? What if it was just an incredibly advanced, conscious application of the body's own electrical system? So what does this all add up to? Well, the source basically lays out a new set of theses for a totally different kind of reformation. Not a theological one, but a practical, biological one. A reformation built on principles like death is optional, miracles are just a form of technology, salvation is a cellular process, and you are the temple. And this final quote just perfectly nails the difference. The Protestant Reformation, it says, just rearrange the furniture inside the prison. This new Reformation, it's about remembering that you were never actually in prison to begin with. The limits we accept, especially death, were never as solid as we were told.
So that's what we're left with. Is this whole thing just a forgotten piece of history, an interesting footnote for scholars to debate? Or, as the source so boldly claims, is it a suppressed blueprint for a radically different human future, just sitting there, waiting for us to rediscover it? Well, that's something for you to think about.